Yes, perfect.
Okay. Should I go?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. So before I start, let me thank again Andrea and Lara for the invitation and the whole Hermes Science team for putting together this very nice, interesting workshop. So with this talk, we continue the discussion gamma ray bursts, which are prime target for Hermes. And now we move to a much more, say, theoretical point of view. In particular, I've been asked to discuss the connection between short gamma ray bursts and binary neutron star mergers. And as you know, this connection found amazing smoking gun evidence in the multi-messenger event of August 2017. So that's where I will start, briefly summarizing what we learned from this event from the gamma ray burst point of view. This was a major breakthrough, of course, but left behind a number of very important open questions on the mechanism through which binary star merger can actually produce a short gamma ray burst. So the central part of the talk will be about, say, discussing and updating on what we've been able to learn so far in this context. So the connection, how, in particular, binary star merger can produce a jet that will make a short gamma ray burst. And this is mostly based, this knowledge is mostly based on very complex general relativistic magnetohydrodynamic simulations. So this will be the central part of the talk. In the end, I will also try to make a connection between these physical models, which are sort of limited in scale, time and spatial scale, the challenge of connecting this to the actual scales of the electromagnetic emission, so the prompt and afterglow emission. So that's sort of a timeline. Slide doesn't change. Okay. Okay, so we start with the famous event, GW17817. That's the well-known timeline with the gravitational wave detected first by LIGO Virgo detectors. Shortly after, we have a peculiar burst of gamma rays that was eventually recognized as a canonical, say, short gamma ray burst. And then we have much later the discovery of the optical infrared counterpart, which instead relates to the so-called kilonova. And this was very important also to pinpoint the host galaxy and trigger the huge observational campaign in all bands. And then 9 and 16 days later, we have also the first X-ray and radio afterglow measurements. And this afterglow then continued to provide key information for later also in the optical band, actually for several months. So we're interested in the short gamma ray burst. So all the electromagnetic signals, say, above the line, not only gamma rays, but also the afterglow. This is the gamma ray signal, GRB17817A, detected by Fermi and Integral. And this emerged about 1.74 seconds after the time of merger estimated from the gravitational wave signal that you see below. And the basic question is, did we expect something like a gamma ray burst associated with a binary star merger? And the answer is yes. So you've seen this also in the talk by Giancarlo. You know that gamma ray bursts are divided between long and short, depending on this bimodal distribution of duration, canonically separated at 2 seconds. And we know that long gamma ray bursts are associated with the core collapse of massive stars. So they're associated with particularly energetic supernovae, and we have a number of coincident detections that prove it. On the other side, before August 2017, we thought that short gamma ray bursts would probably relate to the merger of neutron star or neutron star black hole mergers, based on some indirect pieces of evidence that I list here. But what we've been dreaming of, what we've been really waiting for as a smoking gun evidence was the coincident detection of a short gamma ray burst with the gravitational waves from the merger. And we think that now with some confidence that the event of August 2017 provided such evidence. So, yeah, so I probably can skip this. So just to point out that any gamma ray burst has as basic ingredient a relativistic jet with prompt and afterglow emission produced The first one in shocks, internal shocks within the jet, and afterglows instead produced at the front via synchrotron emission. I guess everyone knows all this, so I can just move on. So we have this smoking gun evidence, but actually at the beginning it was not that clear that this was a short gamma ray burst like the others that we know, and not some other type of gamma ray burst, maybe a new type. And that's because while this looked barely consistent with the short gamma ray burst without accounting for the distance, when we include the 40 megaparsec distance, so that's way closer than any other GRB ever observed, we see that this is orders of magnitude less energetic. So we see energy versus redshift here on the left, some long gamma ray burst in blue, some short gamma ray burst in orange, and our event is the little star down there. So this is really peculiar, and that's one big point. Another point is that the afterglow radiation we've seen in X-rays and radio were initially raising in time, and this was inconsistent with an ultra-relativistic jet pointing towards us. And then there are also other aspects that I don't have time to go in, but one possible explanation that would fit these things together is that this was a canonical short gamma ray burst, but pointing away, say 15, 30 degrees away from our point of view. And this is depicted in the scheme on the right. And the gamma rays that we observed were not produced by the jet core, but rather by the mild relativistic hot cocoon formed around the jet, around the core of the jet, by the interaction of the incipient jet across the barium polluted environment surrounding the merger site. However, this explanation worked as well as another hypothesis that there was no successful jet and just a mild relativistic wide angle, say choke jet scenario. Up to about 200 days after merger, we didn't have enough information to disentangle the two. And the final answer came later thanks to very large baseline interferometry observation in the radio band that were able, on the one hand, to measure the apparent motion of the source of the radio afterglow, and on the other hand, to put stringent constraints on the size of the source in time. And putting these two things together, we come to the conclusion that this was a collimated jet with just a few degrees of half opening angle, but seen away from us by 15, 30 degrees. So we could exclude the other hypothesis of a nearly isotropic mild relativistic outflow, or the choke jet. So in the end, we had the answer. This was say an observer along the jet axis would have seen a short gamma ray burst consistent with the others that we know. But we were, for the first time, seeing this phenomenon off axis. So this was definitely a great breakthrough. Finally, we have this proof. But as I was saying at the beginning, this left behind very important open question. We still don't know exactly how a binary star merger can produce a jet, and also whether the remnant object acting as a central engine was in this case a black hole with a accretion disk or a massive long-lived neutron star. And in this kind of question, this is where very complex general relativistic simulation come into play as the leading tool to really understand the physical conditions to launch a relativistic jet. We learned already from in the recent years that one of the mechanisms that were proposed for launching a jet based on neutrino-antineutrino annihilation as energy reservoir is probably not powerful enough. So we're now converging to the idea that the jet should be magnetically driven. And this implies that any study of jet formation should be done in GR-MHD, so including magnetic fields. And that's a big complication for the models because and only a few groups worldwide are able to actually do binary star merger simulation with magnetic fields. So before saying more about this, let me just quickly remind what is the rich phenomenology of binary star mergers. So depending on the mass, if the mass is very high, the merger should produce a prompt collapse to a black hole with a very light disk that will probably not power a short gamma-ray burst. For lower mass, we can have the more likely formation of a metastable neutron star that will survive for a while and eventually collapse to a black hole surrounded by a disk. And if the mass is even lower, we have the more rare possibility of producing a stable neutron star that will never collapse. So in the case of a 17/17 event, we probably are in this massive metastable neutron star channel with the eventual collapse to a black hole. What we couldn't say, what we cannot say even today, is whether the jet was launched before the collapse to a black hole or after the collapse. So in other words, if the central engine powering the jet was, in this case, the metastable neutron star or the accreting black hole. So let's first focus on the black hole scenario. So in this case, actually until early 2017, most simulations devoted to this problem were focusing on this case, where you have the formation of a black hole accretion disk system within a few tenths of a millisecond after merger. And this system with a disk mass of say 10% of solar mass, which is very typical, if magnetic field is strong enough, has all the ingredients to power a relativistic jet via the Blanford-Naik mechanism, in which the ultimate energy reservoir is the black hole rotation channeled by the magnetic field. And this is a very powerful mechanism that is already known in other contexts like AGNs, so it's very promising. And that's why people focused on this case. And so far, we had some important progress in this direction. And in particular, Ruiz et al. In 2016, the bottom left case, the Illinois group were able to obtain, for the first time, the formation of a collimated, mildly relativistic, magnetically dominated outflow along the axis of the black hole, with properties that could, in principle, evolve into a proper jet with high Lorentz factor and high point in flux luminosity, matching the Blanford-Naik requirements. So these results are very encouraging. We don't have yet all the, we cannot say that everything is exactly as it should be, but this is very promising and is a case under investigation. Now, moving on to the other, from some point of view, more interesting alternative of the massive long-lived neutron star. This case was quite ignored until early 2017, where we published the first systematic investigation. Then we continued to invest on this channel. We made some important progress up to the the latest results obtained earlier this year. And this is what I want to spend a few minutes now. So just to picture this type of simulation, I have here some snapshots from one of our simulations, where we have the time sequence going clockwise from top left, as you can imagine. And all of this process takes about 50 milliseconds. So this is the typical timescale covered by this type of simulations. In our 2019 study, we were able to do a simulation covering 100 milliseconds of the evolution of the massive neutron star, so after merger. And this is much more than before and allowed us to learn very important things about the evolution of magnetic fields and their feedback on the dynamics of the remnant. So for example, on the left, we see the magnetic field amplification via the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability and magnetic rotation instability up to a saturation level around 10 to the 51 ergs that we were not able to see before because the previous simulation were too short. And the magnetic field that you achieve here is order 10 to the 16 Gauss. So these are really the strongest magnets in the universe, so above the magnetar level. On the right, we see also how the magnetic field can also gradually rearrange its geometrical structure and possibly form helical structures along the rotation axis. And these are related to jet formation, so we'll come back to this. The other important aspect is that binary star merger heats up the remnant, and material from the outer layers is pushed away. So some material is expelled by the remnant in the form of a baryon-loaded wind that creates a slowly expanding cloud of dense cloud of material around the remnant. So we see on top right the meridional view of the density at 90 milliseconds after merger on a large scale of more than 1,000 kilometers. And why is this important? It's important because if at some point the central object produces an incipient jet that tries to emerge, all this material can represent an obstacle opposing the jet. And this is different from the black hole case, as you see below, where instead along the spin axis, the density is orders of magnitude lower. So in that case, a jet can more easily drill through without problems, essentially. What we learned from this simulation is that the presence of magnetic fields can strongly enhance these winds. So you see on the left the cumulative mass outflow compared to the non-magnetized case. And so essentially the magnetic field, which is supposed to be the main driver of jet formation, at the early times is at the same time responsible for the creation of an obstacle that will oppose the propagation of the jet. So the outcome is difficult to anticipate. And at this point, with this result, we were quite pessimistic about the possibility of forming a jet without a black hole, with a neutron star remnant. And this brings us to the latest results. So we performed 2 new simulations with masses and properties compatible with 17017, with different initial magnetization levels. And we got more ambitious and evolved this up to more than 250 milliseconds after merger, so more than a quarter of a second. This was a big effort, but it really paid off because this time, for the higher magnetization case, we have seen something new happening. So this is a meridional view from 100 milliseconds after merger up to more than 200 milliseconds. This is large scale, more than 3,000 kilometers. In the top row, we have the density. In the bottom row, a different quantity where essentially in red, you have material that is bound, gravitationally bound, while in blue, you have material that has enough kinetic energy to escape. And this is very nice to visualize faster outflows in your system. What we have is that up to 100 milliseconds, we have a similar evolution as we've seen before. But then at later times, we see the production of a collimated outflow that breaks out of the slower surrounding material and finally acquires a more definite shape of a conical shape with half opening angle of 15 degrees or so. So for the first time in a magnetized binary star merger simulation forming not a black hole, but a long-lived massive neutron star, we have seen that a collimated outflow can be produced. And this was something new. Interestingly, the lower magnetization case didn't show anything like that. So we also learned that in this case, essentially the opposing effect of the environment wins. And we learned that not all neutron star remnant will produce the same outcome. But focusing now on the successful case, we were able to follow the whole process, all development of the outflow up to the final decline of its power that you can see on the top right. And this was very important to set the timescale for the process, but also to study in full the energetics of this phenomenon. And we see on the left, on the top panel, the energy in this outflow. The total is in blue, and then you have components, kinetic, magnetic, internal energy. And there is a general growth up to about 160 milliseconds, and then a sort of saturation. Below, we have the rotational energy of the neutron star, which also changes behavior around 160 milliseconds. There is a rapid decline, and then this turns into a slower linear decline. And the inset shows the rotational profile of the core of the neutron star. And again, at around 160 milliseconds, something important happens. namely the strong differential rotation that you have at the beginning is removed, becomes a uniformly rotating neutron star core. So these are signs that the rotational and differential rotation in the neutron star is the energy reservoir of this outflow. When this is over, the power is over. So what is then the mechanism? The mechanism is magnetorotational. We have magnetic field amplification of the magnet in the core of the neutron star, and this builds up a growing magnetic pressure and magnetic pressure gradients, radial gradients, in particular along the spin axis. And this corresponds to an active force pushing material along the same axis. This is confirmed when we look at the magnetic field structure, where we see this helical structure along the spin axis extending up to very large scales. And to be more explicit, I also show down here the radial gradient of magnetic pressure, where blue essentially means a force directed outwards. So all of this confirms our picture. So we've seen this collimated outflow. We understood what is the mechanism to produce this. That's all very nice, but let's come to the big question, which is, can this outflow power or evolve, say, into something that can make a short gamma ray burst? And the answer is no. No, because the energy and collimation are not sufficient to match the 17817 parameters, but most importantly, the Lorentz factor is a big problem. So the outflow velocity here is limited to 20% of the speed of light, while for a short gamma ray burst jet, we need a Lorentz factor of about at least 10, so 0.995 C. And even if we turn all the energy into radial kinetic energy, we have here at least 3 orders of magnitude too heavy outflow to have any chance of evolving to Lorentz factor of 10. So what we conclude is that while a neutron star can make collimated outflow, most likely the properties of this outflow, there will be a huge gap between these properties and what is necessary to make a short gamma ray burst jet. So this result disfavor this massive neutron star scenario and favor the alternative case of a black hole accretion disk central engine. So this conclusion is not final. There are things that can be improved in the simulation, but you get an idea where we are today, essentially. Just keep in mind that this is still under investigation and there's still space for surprises. So solving the puzzle of the central engine of short gamma ray burst is going to be very important for interpreting the data, especially for events where we have also gravitational wave detection. For example, if we know that the central engine is a black hole, we can constrain much better the physical scenario and also benefit other aspects, related aspects like the kilonova or the viewing angle, so the Hubble constant measurement, and so on. But if we want to fully exploit the rich information encoding the electromagnetic observations, we cannot do only binary star merger simulation. We need to do more, because these are limited to scales of only order 100 millisecond, 1,000 kilometers. So they can show the formation of an incipient jet, but not the evolution of the jet up to the large scales relevant for the electromagnetic radiation. For this reason, there's a lot of effort, parallel, independent from merger simulation, to model the propagation of incipient jet in environments that mimic what you have after binary star mergers. So we have models in analytical, semi-analytical. We have simulations in special relativity, in hydrodynamics, and also magnetohydrodynamics. There is really a lot of literature on this. There are, I think, 20 papers only in 2020 on this very hot topic. And I show here some examples. The idea of this studies is to be able to predict the final jet structure, and whatever property can be directly constrained with observation, starting from a set of parameters describing the say incipient jet and the environment at the time of jet formation. And just as an example, I mentioned here recent work that we did where we consider an analytical model, and we use this to map input parameters that I show here in blue. These include incipient jet, so the initial jet properties, the jet launching time, the density of the environment, but also the viewing angle, to map this into output parameters, which are the ones that can be constrained with observation. So the jet structure, or along the line of sight, the isotropic equivalent energy, Lorentz factor, and the delay between gravitational wave trigger and the actual onset of the gamma ray signal. So since we can constrain this, moving backward, we can identify the set of parameters that are consistent with the constraints, of input parameters that are consistent with the constraints. And we adopted a Monte Carlo approach here, and we got some interesting indication. For example, down here, we see that most likely the jet launching time was quite early, less than, say, half a second, even though we have started seeing gamma rays only, let's say, almost around 2 seconds after merger. So these are just an example, but these models can really provide interesting constraints. On the other hand, they share a important limitation. All these models assume a certain set of properties for the environment at jet launching time, and then these are very much simplified usually, and then just throw in a jet with certain properties and see what happens. But so as a consequence, there is no connection with the merger dynamics, the launching mechanism, or the properties of the central engine. So just as a look at the future in this last slide, if we really want to do a quality step forward, probably the next big challenge is to try to put together these things. Have one model that goes from in spiral to merger, jet formation, breakout, and then its evolution up to the scales where electromagnetic radiation can be emitted. So this is very challenging because it means putting together different types of simulations. But I think times are mature to start doing some first steps in this direction. So there's a sort of teaser for the future. And I come to the conclusion. So basically, basic message is we know that binary star merger produce short gamma ray burst. We still don't know what is the mechanism or the central engine. We have some ideas. So this probably magnetically driven jet could be from a black hole disk system or from a long-lived neutron star. This is the realm of GRMHD simulations that are quite challenging. Only a few groups in the world are able to do this at the moment. And current results tend to favor the black hole scenario, but this is not the final word. Moving closer to observation, we have a lot of effort attempting to understand the propagation of incipient jet across the environment. But there is this disconnection of this type of models with respect to the binary star merger models. So this next challenge that I propose is that we should start putting things together. And with that, I think I can stop. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Riccardo. And I see that we have already 2 questions in the chat. So Sylvia first.